All right. Hey, well, good morning, wildlife. Go ahead and grab a Bible if you haven't grabbed one already. If you forgot to bring one, you can borrow one of ours. Are you guys awake this morning? You guys here? Ready to go? Awesome. You had a Red Bull? Whoa. I'm just curious, what size Red Bull do you get? Do you get the small one, the 12 ounce, the 16 ounce, the 20 ounce, the 12 ounce? Okay. All right. Does it give you wings? Have you flown? No, not yet. Okay. Does that? It's a scam. A lot of things are scams. Monster's better. How much energy drinks do you drink? A lot. Wow, I can tell. Hey, by a show of hands, who drinks energy drinks? Okay. All right, Brinley, what's your preferred energy drink? Celsius. Okay. Yeah. Anyone else is like, yeah, Celsius. Yeah. Okay. Anyone drink Monster? Okay. All right. Anyone drink Red Bull? Okay. Anyone drink the classic coffee? Does anyone drink my favorite Coca-Cola? Anyone? Yeah. Hey, well, if you and I haven't had the chance to meet, my name is Johnny, and I'm on staff here in Wildlife. And what we're about to do is we're about to head into what we call a time of teaching. Now, this time is super important, not because anything I'm about to say, but because it's our opportunity to go to God's Word to see who is Jesus, what is Jesus calling us to as wildlife, and how we're going to see Jesus transform our lives. You see, when we gather here every Saturday night, every Sunday morning, man, change happens. And it's not because of Impossible Shot, even though it's awesome. It's not because of the games like Canada. It's because we get to go before God and ask him to teach us about who he is so that we can experience his awesome power. Now, as we head into this time, there's something called a message note sheet. So if you have it, just wave it above your head. Just so you know you have one. Awesome. I love that noise. We should get that noise on the soundboard. Now, this is a great way to follow along as we head into this time of teaching. It's not a test. It's not a quiz. We're not trying to trick you in any way, but this is an awesome opportunity for us to hopefully remember something that the Lord is going to be teaching us this morning. So without further ado, let's go ahead and pray. And we will get started. Let's go ahead, bow our heads, and let's go ahead and pray. So Jesus, grateful that you are with us, you are for us, you are not against us. Jesus, you are in this very room right now. And Jesus, I never want to lose sight of how awesome that truth is, that wherever we go, you are always with us. Whether it's at school in the middle of a test where we just have crazy anxiety, whether it's at home. And home life is really, really hard. And we don't know what the next day or the next week may look like. Jesus, wherever we go, you are with us. So Jesus, as we meet here this morning, as we come here, maybe some of us are a little tired. Maybe some of us have had way too much Red Bull. Jesus, we're grateful because you're with us. And it's in your name we all said, amen. Hey, well, I want to play a third game this morning. So what I need from you guys is I need someone to give me a thumbs up. Try that. Just give me a thumbs up. I want to make sure you know how to play this game. So thumbs up. And then now stay with me here. This next moment is really tricky. Now do a thumbs down. Don't strain yourself. Okay, Brody, good form, Brody. Good form. Now, this game is super easy. So what's going to happen is there's going to be an image on the screen behind me of a superhero, a supervillain, or just a character in pop culture. You have to say, are they a good guy or a bad guy? All right, let's see this first one on the screen. Super easy. Here we go. Iron Man, good guy or bad guy? Bad guy? You've had too much Red Bull, all right? So Iron Man, he's a good guy. Awesome. Rest in peace, Iron Man. Iron Man is going to become Dr. Doom, apparently. It doesn't make sense. But let's go to this next one on the screen. Thanos. Good guy. It's concerning to me that you're saying Iron Man's bad and Thanos is good. Praying for your heart. So Thanos is bad. Let's go to this next one on the screen. Venom. This is kind of like a tricky area, right? So if you've seen like the Venom movies, which I've seen half of the first one, and then I got really bored because they're not good. Venom's kind of like a good guy, like an anti-hero, kind of good, kind of bad. He eats people, which is terrible. Don't do that. So it's kind of a mixed bag. Let's go to this next one on the screen. Spider-Man. bad? Oh, come on. He betrayed his girlfriend? How? How did he betray his girlfriend in the third? We don't have time to get into that. I have so many questions, Henry. Henry, I'm praying for your heart. Let's go to this next one. Elsa. Hey, so Sadie is saying thumbs up. Her brother Brody is saying thumbs down. I'm sure at the Gillen household, it's just conflict all the time. Now, here's the thing with Elsa. Hold on. Shh. Elsa, originally, before the first Frozen came out, and if you didn't know this, she was supposed to be the villain originally. And I think she still somewhat is the villain. Hear me out. She froze an entire town, and everyone just went, okay. And second, she almost killed her sister on accident in the name of love. That is terrible. So good guy, bad guy, I don't know. I think she just has to let it go. All right? She needs to let her feelings go. Let's go with this next one on the screen. Loki. Good. So now he did steal the Tesseract. Hey, now if you aren't familiar with the Avengers movies or the Marvel movies, what rock have you been living under? All right. Now, if you aren't familiar, I am a huge Marvel fan. As of late, not so much. But I thought you were holding up a cross for a second. I was like, what am I doing? As of late, though, some of the best parts of Marvel have been a TV show known as Loki. Has anyone ever seen this TV show Loki before? Well, if you haven't heard of it, or if you aren't familiar with it, basically, hold on. Basically, a few years ago, there's 2 seasons now of Loki, season 1, season 2. And basically in this TV show, Loki, it's kind of like outside of time. He's part of what we call the TVA, the Time Variance Authority. And basically he is outside of time. And there's one part in the first season of this show where he kind of gets like a glimpse of everything bad that he has done. And up to this moment, Loki thinks everything he's doing is like for a good reason and stuff. And you see that he's done a lot of bad things. And later on in this show, he actually becomes a good guy. And actually, I love this show. This is a great show. He actually becomes a good guy. And what we see with another character known as Mobius on the next image behind me, played by Owen Wilson. If you want to hear an awesome Owen Wilson impression, talk to Brody. All right. He does an awesome Owen Wilson impression. But basically what we find out in this show is that Loki is not really consistent with being a bad guy. There's actually a lot of good in Loki. And as we see time and time again, he does a lot of good things. That if you actually look at Loki's life from like the first Thor movie to the first Avengers movie to like the second Thor movie to the third Thor movie, he does a lot of bad things and then he's doing some good things. And you're like, oh, Loki's actually a good guy now. And then he betrays someone. You're like, what is happening? But in this TV show, he actually becomes a good guy. Not to spoil the end of season 2, he actually kind of sacrifices himself for the better good of like the entire multiverse. And the reason I share that is that as we continue this series we started last weekend called Listen and Follow, the story of a prophet, what we're going to see is that this prophet known as Jonah is not really consistent with being a prophet. Now, to catch you up real quickly, last weekend we started this series called Listen and Follow. And the whole premise of this series is understanding and looking at the fact that as a follower of Jesus, as someone that wants to follow Jesus, what we would call a Christian, their life should be very consistent with living a life that is actually following Jesus. And what we're going to see this morning is that Jonah's life is not really consistent. You're going to see, like last weekend from chapter 1 to chapter 2, he's doing and saying a lot of things that don't seem to be matching up. And what we're going to see this morning is, what does that mean for our lives? So if you guys have a note sheet with you, on the top of the note sheet, we're going to do a quick little recap. If you weren't with us last weekend or you got hit by a piano and you totally forgot it, we'll catch us up. Or you had way too much Red Bull and you're like, my heart won't stop beating. You should probably stop. But it says this on the top of your note sheet. From Jonah chapter 1, which is what we looked at last week, we saw that Jonah is a prophet of God. Can anyone remind us what a prophet is? What our simple, yeah. what is it? A messenger of God. That's what a prophet is at its simple core being. A prophet is someone that would receive a message from God and that they would go and tell the message to whatever people group. Now, in this context, Jonah was given a message from God, and he was to go to Nineveh, which is one of the most terrible, most evil cities during this time. And Jonah knew it. He wasn't like surprised. And Jonah ran away from God. So on your note sheet, Jonah 1:3 says this, but Jonah ran away from the Lord. And what we learned about last week is that Jonah disobeyed God. And what we unpacked last week is that what does it mean to really disobey God? And basically what we looked at is that when we disobey God, that means our hearts are out of alignment with Jesus. That when we're not listening and following to God, we're going to become out of alignment with God's will, and we're not going to have hearts that really listen and follow. And we talked about this. It takes practice. This takes time. But we're going to unpack this morning Jonah chapter 2. So if you guys have a Bible with you, we're going to be opening it up to Jonah chapter 2. Keep in mind, last week we looked at Jonah chapter 1. Now we're going to pick up right where we left off in chapter 2. So if you guys have a Bible with you, we're going to be in the first half of the Bible known as the Old Testament. If you have a physical Bible with you, in every Bible, there's what we call a table of contents in the first couple pages. Use that as a tool to find the right page, all right? So Jonah chapter 2, and we're going to be starting at verse 1. Now, give me a thumbs up if you're there. Good to go. Thank you, Ricardo. Sweet. I'll give you a couple more seconds here. I'll kind of recap last weekend with what we read. So remember, Jonah disobeyed God. He's like, God, I'm not going to listen to you. I'm going to go as far away from Nineveh as possible. So he gets on a boat going to Tarshish. And basically, he is found himself in this giant storm. And these sailors are like, hey, who are you? Where have you come from? Like, are you the reason why this is happening? And Jonah says, yep, I am a Hebrew. I worship the God of the heavens, of the earth, and of the sea. And they go, well, what have you done to allow all of this to happen? What did you do that God is allowing all of this to happen? And then they're like, well, what should we do to resolve this? And Jonah says, throw me overboard, which I think is really cowardice because he's trying to get further and further away from Nineveh. And he's like, all right, just throw me in the water. All right. And then now this is where we pick up in this moment. The storm is now gone and Jonah is now sinking down to the bottom. And this is what it says at the end of chapter 1 in verse 17. Right above verse 1 in chapter 2, it says this. Now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah. Has that ever happened to you? Like, to be honest, when I go into the ocean, I'm always scared that a shark is going to hit me or kill me or poke me or something. I'm never worried that a giant fish is about to swallow me. But it says, God provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Now, this is not like a nice Airbnb, all right? This is smelly. This is gross. It's really dark and probably kind of warm, to be honest. But that's where we find Jonah. So what I'm calling this is Jonah's kind of like in a timeout where he has been disobeying God, and God's like, whoa, hey, we need a reset right now. We need to talk this out. And this is what then happens. Jonah then prays to God. In verse 1, it says this, from inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. He said, in my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From the deep in the realm of the dead, I called for help, and you listened to my cry. You hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the seas. And the current swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight. Yet I will look again towards your holy temple. The engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. To the earth beneath the buried me in forever. But you, Lord my God, brought my life up from the pit. When my life was ebbing away, if you have a pen with you, underline those 2 words, ebbing away. We're going to come back to that a little bit later. I remember you, Lord. And my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. I will say salvation comes from the Lord. And the Lord then commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. Imagine seeing that for a moment, right? You're like walking along the beach, and then you just see this giant fish. You're like, ah. And then just like this super like pale dude just comes, because all the stomach acid has like made him as like pale as a ghost. And then you just like, you just keep going throughout your day. Now, what's interesting here, that's our passage for this morning. What's interesting is that God provided a giant fish to save Jonah's life. That as Jonah was about to die by drowning, he looks out and he sees this giant fish heading his way. And that's probably the last thing he saw for 3 days and 3 nights, because in the belly of the fish, it was really dark in there. And what's interesting is that the fish, when he saw that, he probably thought, okay, I'm done for. But what's interesting, what should have killed him, the fish, or even being drowned, actually saved him. But the craziest thing to me is this. The first fill-in on your note sheet, here's the craziest thing. As we read this, here's the craziest thing, is that Jonah never says he's sorry. Jonah never said that he's sorry to God. That in a typical circumstance, if I found myself in this circumstance, I would hope that I would then realize maybe I'm out of alignment with God. And maybe I need to repent and to say I'm sorry, to change my ways. But Jonah doesn't do that. If anything, Jonah just really appreciates God for not leaving him, and he really appreciates that he's not dead. But he doesn't say that he's sorry. Follow along with me on your Bible. So in Jonah chapter 2, jump down to verse 2, and here's an example of this. He says, "In my distress, I called to the name of the Lord, and he answered me. From the deep in the realm of the dead, I called for help, and you listened to my cry." Jump down to verse 6. "To the roots of the mountain I sank down." And then jump down later on to verse 6. "But you, Lord, my God, brought my life up from the pit." So this is really interesting. Jonah never says technically that he's sorry. But he really appreciates and loves the fact that God did not abandon him. So what we see here is that Jonah looks to God in the middle of a bad situation. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never been in this type of situation before, like in the belly of a fish. But this seems like a bad situation, right? So what we see here is Jonah, man, he appreciates and loves the fact that God did not abandon him. And honestly, what we see about God's character here is that God shows Jonah mercy in the midst of this situation. That God easily could have just been like, all right, Jonah, I'm not going to use you because clearly you're not listening and following. And what's interesting, if God allowed that to happen, to be like, all right, Jonah, I'll find someone else to do my will, Jonah probably would have died in that fish, which is just funny to think about. But anyway, so that begs the question for us too. Like when we find ourselves in a situation where we're not listening and following to God, we might find ourselves in a situation where God just allows us to continue not listening and following. But what's beautiful about who God is that through his mercy and his grace, even when we're not listening and following, God gives us a second chance. And that's what God does with Jonah here. In verse 7, Jonah continues this prayer. I had you guys underline 2 words, so look down to verse 7 for me. So it says, "When my life was ebbing away." Another word for that is when my life was slipping away. He says, "I remembered you, Lord." And I think for some of us, we can find ourselves here that when we're in the middle of a bad situation in life, whether we're full of anxiety or worry, or we're stressed out, or we feel like we are completely alone, and we feel like we can't turn to anyone, I would say a majority of us, we would turn to God through praying. And that's beautiful. That's awesome. And that's what Jonah did. When we find ourselves in a bad situation, we pray to God. But here's the thing that I think a majority of us do, is that when we find ourselves in a good situation, when life's going really well, we're doing really good in school, home life is awesome, we have a ton of friends, like Fortnite's great, like we're doing really, really well in life. we tend to forget about God. And I don't think we do that intentionally, like, okay, I'm going to wake up this morning and I'm going to forget about God. I don't think we do that. If that's you, I'm praying for you. But I don't think we do that. But I think we tend to forget about God and then we take God for granted. Now, if you ever heard that expression before, taking something or someone for granted basically means that you fail to see the value in someone. And a silly example is that maybe your mom makes the best lasagna. And if she does, invite me over, all right? Let's have some lasagna together. Maybe she makes some of the best food ever. And for you, you have never said thank you to your mom for her. You have to feed me or you're going to go to prison. Like maybe some of us are just like assuming like, well, I have to do that because you're my mom or you're my dad. But we never say thank you and tell them how much we appreciate what they've done for us. And I think in the same way, when life's going really well, we take God for granted. And in this story, we see here that in the middle of this bad situation, Jonah does not say that he's sorry, but he prays, and that's beautiful. But it doesn't seem very consistent with chapter 1 Jonah versus chapter 2. If you remember chapter 1 Jonah, he is just like not listening and following. He hears this message from God, go to Nineveh, tell them like, hey, they're doing everything wrong. And he's like, I'm good. Because remember, Nineveh was a really messed up place. We don't quite know why Jonah doesn't want to go there. We'll find out later on in this book. But when we go to chapter 2, Jonah's prayer doesn't really seem consistent with his life. So here is the big thing I want you guys to remember on your note sheet. Write this down. An inconsistent walk with God reveals misalignment. That an inconsistent walk with God reveals misalignment. And we can see this pretty clear with Jonah, right? He's not really consistent. Now, you might read chapter 2 and be like, oh, he's changing his ways. Just wait. Chapter 3, he's a great prophet. What we're going to see in chapter 3 is that he ends up going to Nineveh, and the message that he shares with all the people there is literally like the bare minimum of what God told him to tell them. And it's as if Jonah doesn't really want to tell them, but he's like, all right, fine, God, I will do what you're calling me to do. But he literally shares the bare minimum. So what we're going to see is that an inconsistent walk with God reveals that there's a misalignment here. That if you remember, when it comes to our lives, we need to constantly be asking God, hey, God, how's my heart doing? And we need to ask, hey, I want to be in alignment with you. I want to follow you. But oftentimes we're not fully aware of where we're kind of at in this walk with Jesus. So we need to keep going before God and asking him, God, how is my heart doing? So some questions to consider as we kind of look at this passage from Jonah's story, from Jonah's life. I think there's a lot of truth for our lives and a lot of questions we should be asking. That, are we only praying to God when we need something from him? Are we only praying to God when we need help from him? And hear me, that's good sometimes. But if we are only praying to God, if we are only thinking about Jesus when we need something from him, that's not really consistent, right? Like we're kind of going to God, kind of thinking of him kind of like a genie. Be like, God, I need these 3 things to happen right now. And I believe that you can do it. But maybe the moment he does it, you're like, great, awesome. And then you kind of just like walk away and just forget everything God has done for you. And to be honest, I think some of us do that, where we take God for granted. Or another question we should be asking, are we only thinking about God when we're at Wildlife? And the moment we leave this building, the moment we leave Rocky Peak and we go home, we go to school, we go to Target, like wherever we go, we just stop remembering God. That we start living our lives like everyone else in this world. But as you know, like as a follower of Jesus, we're designed and we're supposed to be different than everyone else. We're supposed to be set apart for an epic purpose. And hear me, this takes time. This takes time to practice and to remember. I remember when I was in middle school and even in high school is that I really wanted to follow Jesus. But man, I went to a public school. And if you're going to a public school, you know sometimes it's hard to follow Jesus at a public school, even like in a private school. It's hard to follow Jesus because we're surrounded by some people that maybe aren't following Jesus, and we get easily influenced by other people. When I was in middle school, I found myself oftentimes acting completely differently at school than when I was here at church. And it took a couple of years for me to realize that, man, my life isn't really consistent. And I think for some of us, this is how I was in middle school and even parts of high school, that I would sometimes like kind of put on this like double face, that I would completely act differently at school and then act completely differently at church. And it wasn't until someone at school that wasn't a Christian but knew that I went to church, saw me acting a certain way. I don't even know what I was doing, but they saw me act a certain way and they're like, "Wait, don't you go to church? Don't you like follow Jesus and stuff like that?" And I went, "Yeah." And wow, like, to be honest, it like shook me to my core, because I was like, man, I am not being consistent with following Jesus wherever I go. And a follower of Jesus, our lives are supposed to be different than everyone else, so that when someone that doesn't follow Jesus looks at our life, hopefully they're asking the question, whoa, something is different here. And maybe for you, you're looking at your life right now and you're like, man, it's not consistent. And hear me, if you're like, oh no, I'm not being consistent. Hey, hear me. That's okay for right now. The first step to anything is just being aware of something, to being aware of it, so that we can now work on being consistent in our lives. But it doesn't just happen on our own accord. We really need Jesus' help. So we really need to be going before God and asking him to help us be consistent with following him. So question is your life consistent with following Jesus, not just when you're here at church, but when you're at school or when you're at a friend's house, when you're at band practice, basketball practice? Is your life consistent with following Jesus? For example, maybe here at Wildlife, you're like, okay, I'm going to really watch my language. I'm going to make sure I'm not going to cuss a bunch. Could you imagine? Anyway, but then when you're at school, you say all of this type of language and you just don't think twice about it. That's not really consistent. That a follower of Jesus is someone that is very mindful of their words and of their actions, hoping that it's very reflective of what it means to follow Jesus. That our lives are supposed to resemble Christ-like behavior. And that begins with our words and our actions. So maybe when we're here at Wildlife, we are very much aware that we're not going to tear people down. We're not going to make fun of people. We're going to be very respectful to our leaders. Appreciate that, by the way. But when we're at school, we're really disrespectful to our teachers. We're just saying a ton of bad language at school. And then people hear that and they go, whoa, don't you go to church and stuff like that? That's not being consistent. So hear me. Hey, if that's you, I'm not here to like, how dare you do this? But now you're aware of it. Now we can start practicing following Jesus. And the more you practice something, hopefully the easier it gets. But we can't do it on our own strength. We need God's help. So here's our action step. So the action step is simply this: asking the question, how's my heart? If you were with us last week, you'll remember a very similar question, that when we're realizing we're not in alignment with Jesus, we need to go before God and just simply ask him, hey, God, how's my heart? Because our hearts matter to Jesus. Our hearts matter to God. If you remember, in the Bible, the heart is mentioned 830 times. So clearly, our hearts matter a lot to God, and the state of our hearts matter. So when we go before God and asking him, God, how's my heart? And again, this takes time and practice. We need to be going before God and asking him this question in humility and being very much aware of like, okay, I might get an answer I don't like. But when we hear what God's sharing with us, we need to be very much aware of like, okay, God, I need your help. That maybe for you, your heart is full of anger, full of bitterness, full of rage, full of jealousy, full of lust, all of these things. And maybe we need to go before God and just be like, God, would you help me? On your note sheet in Psalm 139, it says this: "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. Point out anything in me that offends you and lead me along the path of everlasting life." And that's a beautiful prayer that I've shared last week, and I pray constantly in my own life. That when I feel like life is going really well, I need to be aware that, okay, God, I need to check my own heart. And just because life's going really well doesn't mean that there's not things that I need to work on, that I need God's help in. So as the band comes up, I want to remind us of a simple way that I have done this in my own life, that when we are out of alignment with Jesus, that when we are going one way and we're off just by like 1 degree, we're going to find ourselves completely off course, and God's over here and we're going this way. And we're like, whoa, I thought I was following Jesus, but I didn't check my heart. So here are the 3 simple steps that we talked about last week. Number 1, we need to go before God and ask God, hey, how's my heart? Because everything you do flows out of your heart. Everything you say and everything you do in life comes from the state of your heart. And if your heart is full of evil and wickedness, very much like Nineveh, which we'll look at next week, then our lives are going to reflect that. So that's step 1. God, how's my heart doing? And this Psalm 139 is a great prayer to start doing. And then step 2 is this: then we need to wait and listen to what we feel like God's revealing to us. And hear me, this takes time. This takes practice. I'm not expecting anyone like to get this day 1. This takes time. This takes practice. And then step 3 is this: once we feel like we know what God is sharing with us, like, hey, Johnny, this is the state of your heart. Step 3 is then we follow. We simply go, God, I need your help in this situation. I cannot do this on my own. And what I love about God is a very patient God. The Bible describes God as slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. That God is a God that keeps his promises, like we sang earlier. But as we go into this last song of worship, we're going to simply just sing about how we want our lives to become more like Jesus. That at the end of the day, a follower of Jesus is someone that desires to become more like Jesus. If we faithfully listen and follow God in our lives, we will become more like Jesus. But hey, this takes time. This may take, maybe for some of us, a long time of wrestling with God and asking questions. Maybe for some of us, it might take a shorter amount of time, but it still takes time. So I'm going to invite you guys to do something. I'm going to invite you guys to close your eyes, and I want you just to listen to this psalm once again, and just in your head, go ahead and close your eyes out of just respect for even if you're like, this is not my thing, just close your eyes out of respect. And I want you just to pray this prayer in your head and really go before God and just be like, God, would you search me? Because God knows us better than we know ourselves. So guys, where you're at, just close your eyes. Just out of respect for the people around you, out of the respect for me, go ahead and close your eyes and say this prayer in your head. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. Point out anything in me that offends you and lead me along the path of everlasting life. So Jesus, we ask, God, that you would search us because you know us better than we know ourselves. Would you search our hearts? Would you bring to the surface, point out anything in us, Jesus, that offends you, that you look at and it just offends you, it dishonors your name. Because Jesus, we want to be a ministry, we want to be a people that is listening and following to you, but it starts with the state of our hearts. So Jesus, would you reveal to us our hearts? And it's in your name we all said, amen. I'm going to invite you guys to stand on up and let's worship.